Now, in that food web, you might be wondering, what's the most important organism? Maybe to you, the largemouth bass is the most important organism because you really like fishing and that's your favorite thing to fish. Or you may say, well, snails are really important because I love snails. I love eating snails, so those are the most important. Or maybe you'll say the producers, they're the most important. They supply the rest of the food chain. And all of those things are right. They're all important, and they're all important for different ways. But some species have a disproportionate amount of influence on an ecosystem. They are more important, so to speak, maybe because they keep the rest of the ecosystem alive, so to speak. And we call those species keystone species. And the reason they're called a keystone, what that is in an arch or a bridge, there is one stone at the top that holds the entire bridge together. You get rid of that stone, the whole thing comes down. If you get rid of one of these side stones, it's okay because it'll shift a little bit, but it's fine. But this keystone is keeping this entire arc up and raised. So keystone species kind of does the same thing. That species is maintaining that entire ecosystem and really increasing the biological diversity or the biodiversity in that area. So let me talk about two different examples. The first one is this little fish. It's about the size of your thumb, maybe a little bit larger, and you can find it in a lot of tropical streams like the one you see here. This is called the banded Tetra. If any of you guys have fish tanks, you probably have Tetra, not banded Tetra, but some sort of Tetra fish. Very generic fish. We don't eat, as humans, we don't eat them. For us, no direct benefit. But in these streams, actually incredibly beneficial. So what these guys do is they produce a ton of phosphorus. So in their waste, they're creating nitrogen just like most waste. Our waste is a lot of nitrogen. Their waste has nitrogen, but also has a lot of phosphorus. Just the way their body works, the way they consume things, they release a lot of phosphorus. Now, that might not matter much, but in streams, in freshwater streams and freshwater ponds, one of the limiting nutrients is phosphorus. So plants can grow but so large because they're lacking this nutrient. They get tons of nitrogen from the waste of all these organisms, but they kind of lack in phosphorus. So these fish, this very interesting fish, and one of the only fish, releases phosphorus. So this phosphorus is actually increasing the producers in this ecosystem. By increasing the producers, it's providing more food for all types of organisms. If the banded Tetra wasn't there, phosphorus wouldn't be released, and there wouldn't be nearly as many producers in these ecosystems. So, it's not at the bottom, or it's at the bottom of the food chain, but still incredibly important. So you may say, well, maybe we should protect the banded Tetra because it's actually really crucial for this ecosystem. And that's why it's important to understand food webs and understand what organisms do in a food web. Because although the general public may not see this species as important, you know that it actually has a big importance which could affect humans if it wasn't around. Another organism is this beautiful sea otter. This is particularly a sea otter out on the west coast, out in California and Alaska. And sea otters love sea urchins. So that's actually what this otter is eating right now, is a whole bunch of sea urchins. When sea otters are around, sea otters are actually a top predator in their ecosystem. When sea otters are around, they eat tons and tons of sea urchins. And this is important because sea urchins, they eat kelp. This is kelp. Kelp is a type of algae. So this is kelp. And I'm going to just also put algae. Remember, algae are plants that are in the water. Now this algae, or a producer, it is anchored, so here's the grass, or like the rocks and sand down here. Urchins come along, and they eat everything on the bottom of the ocean floor. In and of itself, totally fine. But when you have kelp, like this kelp, rooted at the bottom, what happens is urchin comes across and will eat the bottom of that kelp and will essentially take away the trunk of that kelp. And then what happens is the kelp is no longer anchored and it's just floating in the water and eventually will float away. But with otters around, it's fine because otters are eating lots and lots of these urchins. Because they're eating the urchins, the kelp stay in place. You have this beautiful kelp forest. A kelp forest is more or less like a rainforest. You have tons of different organisms. This image down here is kind of showing that. Tons of different organisms that use the kelp forest. Maybe they feed on it, or maybe they just use it as protection. These can be very dense, and baby fish and small animals can hide in the kelp and be protected from predators. So again, kelp forests, very, very high biodiversity. Now, about a century or 2 centuries ago out in California, otters were hunted so much to near extinction for their furs. And what we saw was a drastic change in the ecosystems. Here you're seeing remnants of a kelp forest and tons of urchins on this ocean floor. Again, those kelp are going to eat the bottom of the kelp and the kelp just floats away. You don't have protection for those baby fish anymore. You don't have a food source for so much of that food web. And you see a huge change in this structure where only a couple organisms exist. Now you may think, oh, well, I don't care about otters, I don't care about urchins, I don't care about kelp. They do nothing for me. And maybe you're right, it doesn't do anything for you. But when otters were there, there's a whole bunch of crabs using that ecosystem. There was a whole bunch of large fish using that ecosystem. There were scallops using that ecosystem. But now that ecosystem doesn't exist. So these organisms that are beneficial for humans, that do make humans money, are no longer there either. Now me, on my perspective, I don't care if it makes humans money or not. I think it's important to preserve these kinds of habitats. But unfortunately, that's not how you get the general public behind it. That's not how you get governments behind it. That's not how you get money for it. So it's important to kind of make those connections to really human incentive and human greed, aka just how does this affect us monetarily wise. Maybe it is important to you, maybe it's not important, but it's a way that we can incite change. So in summary, food webs are just a way more complicated food chain, but a lot more accurate way of describing what's happening in an ecosystem. We still have producers and primary consumers, etc., but some organisms will be in multiple different trophic levels. Some organisms are more important than others in the sense that they kind of keep the ecosystem together. Without them, you see huge changes in the ecosystem, much more so than if you were to get rid of another organism.